also start by thanking Minister Al-Jadan and the Managing Director for the invitation, to this wonderful setting, so it's a pleasure to be here. I really enjoyed the paper, the 70 pages of it. It was actually a book more than a paper, okay? So, but actually something very strange happened with me with this paper, because Pierre sent it to me and I was reading it. So I went over the abstract, I was reading the first chapter, and then I have an alarm on my email. And the alarm on my email indicated I had to sign the trade agreement with the US, okay? And suddenly I was inside the paper, okay? So it was kind of weird. That had never happened, because Paul says geopolitical alignments are predictors of bilateral trade outcomes, and that was exactly what I was about to sign. So it's kind of like I was in a virtual reality of Paul Antra's paper, okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the experience of this trade agreement that we signed in the US to kind of go over some of the arguments that Paul does in his paper, and try to shed some alternative light on some of the things that he says. Basically, he does three things. He says three things, or for me, kind of three more very important things. The first one is the share of China's exports into the US have had a dramatic fall. Actually, when I read the numbers, even kind of an informed policymaker, I was not aware of this, go from 22% of US imports to 8%. And this has happened over the last 10 years. Something which is interesting is that half of that happened before Trump, because we tend to associate this mostly to Trump's policy, but actually this is a process that was already occurring, of course with a big step in 2025, okay, as you just mentioned. The second point is that he has a whole section in the paper, he didn't have time to talk about it in his presentation, where he says if geopolitical power is more kind of evenly distributed in the world, that is going to make multilateralism more difficult, is going to generate trade tensions, and probably would lead to this fragmented scenario that he was talking in his slide with higher tariffs, okay? And I want to kind of do a double click on that, because I want to give an alternative perspective on this second point. And then the third was what he mostly spent his time in his presentation, which is the third-party effects of this reallocation of Chinese trade. I mean, Chinese trade doesn't go to the US, goes to other countries. How does that affect? Well, for some countries, maybe it implies more competition in their export market, and that's bad. Maybe it implies cheaper products in their market. I mean, there's a whole number of effects. So what I want to do is I want to focus on the effect of this geopolitical tension on the second dimension, which is how does the geopolitical tensions affect the trade agreements, and what does that do to third parties? So I'm not going to focus so much on the redistribution of Chinese trade, but on the role of geopolitics on third-party effects. So, for example, the agreement with the US, in the case of Argentina, I say it's a great trade agreement for Argentina. It's a great geopolitical agreement for the US. Because the US had geopolitical objectives. They were talking about friendshoring. They want to bring economic activity to countries which they feel more aligned or more comfortable. But that objective of the US opened up very interesting opportunities for opening trade for Argentina and for opening up the US market for Argentine products, and I think that's kind of interesting. So it was kind of, the conversation was interesting because for example, we had to argue with them. Well, they were not going to open everything, so we said, what do we want them to open the American markets to Argentine products? And we had to develop a methodology for that. There what we used is Ricardo Hausmann's product space methodology. Ricardo Hausmann at Harvard, he developed a methodology where he says which goods are close to each other. So for example, if a country exports a good X, and the countries that export good X also export good Y, that means that X and Y are close. So basically we tried to find all the goods that were close to the goods on which Argentina had a comparative advantage, and we used that as an instrument to argue with them which are the goods that should be open and they should open. And actually what we achieved is that basically they capped the reciprocal tariff on all goods, and on about 2,000 products, they basically retracted that reciprocal tariff to zero. So I think that was a very good outcome for Argentina. And for Argentina, in terms of its own opening up, also was quite interesting because with this trade agreement we had to open several sectors, and remember we're in something called Mercosur, and Mercosur somehow has very high external tariffs, so this agreement with the US has allowed us to somehow break a little bit that barrier that Mercosur was and increase the opening up of the economy. That's why I was saying that for Argentina it's actually a very interesting trade agreement. Now let me say one thing which is interesting. The US had these geopolitical objectives, like friendshoring. And for example, they opened up the aircraft industry to Argentine producers. And they also had their domestic issues, for example, pharmaceuticals, like Trump is in this fight with pharmaceutical companies, so they opened up the pharmaceutical market to Argentinian pharmaceutical companies, which actually have a significant comparative advantage there. So I think there's a mixture of the geopolitical issues and the domestic issues in the way the US approached this agreement. I would say on China it was more, there were not kind of any real restrictions. It was more like a surveillance thing, like we want to know what's going on, a sort of request, but not much more than that. Now, let me go just finishing to this idea. I said that these geopolitical tensions, may they lead to more trade and not less trade? Let me challenge that view for a second. And I want to put on the table one thing. Mercosur was negotiating with the European Union a free trade agreement, and we've been negotiating that for 26 years. 26 years. And suddenly we signed it. And I don't think that's independent of what's happening with Trump. So it's interesting because basically the US is kind of breaking this multilateralism, or this multilateralism is breaking because of the tensions, Paul, that you very well described, but it's generating these collateral avenues. And for Argentina, it meant that after 26 years, finally we could sign the Mercosur European Union free trade. We also signed the free trade agreement with EFTA. So suddenly kind of things had deblocked. So may it be possible, and I pose this as a question, that the rupture of multilateralism may in the end lead to more trade and not less trade? So I leave that as a question which I think is interesting, and I don't think there's an obvious answer. And the final point I want to make is in the first graph that Paul showed. He showed that trade was growing very strongly, and then in the 2000s it stopped growing. So now for 20 years we have not deglobalized, but the share of trade in world, the share of trade has kind of stagnated. Okay? I think there's several reasons for that. For example, one reason is basically that as China has huge increases in productivity and becomes more similar to developed economies, then there are less incentives to trade. So maybe there's a natural thing. Maybe that explains why the share of China was falling before Trump. The second potential explanation is that a larger share of trade is digital. It's knowledge, it's goods, it's emails, it's the software, it's patches on software which is going from one country to the other, and that's very significant trade, but it's not measured. So maybe there's some trade that we're not measuring. I think that's a second hypothesis. And the third one has to do with something which Indermit, which I think Indermit is over there, he wrote in The Economist an op-ed 2 weeks ago, and he said, listen, globalization, why is globalization not prospering, not deepening? And we are looking at tariffs. We're all looking at tariffs. Kind of all the attention is in tariffs. But there's something much more damaging and much more devastating for trade than tariffs, which are standards, certifications, sanitary requirements. Because if you have a tariff, you put 10%, 15%, 20%, certainly it's going to affect trade. But if you put a sanitary barrier, it kills trade. It just goes to zero. So it's like an infinite tariff, no? And I think, I see a lot of that in our experience in Argentina. A lot of our exercise in trade liberalization has been much, much more strongly focused on the kind of reducing these standards and their certifications. Actually, this agreement basically allows for a reciprocal recognition of certification. So I think that's also, a point that is a very important part of this picture. Let me stop there.
What I wanted to ask more specifically to you, Minister, is The US is one of the major partners for Argentina, but so is China. And in the context in which you have these tensions between these big powers, do you feel there is a need also on the part of Argentina to exercise caution and to make sure that you don't create future vulnerabilities? How do you think strategically about this double dependency between trading partners that are actually reducing their bilateral exposure?
Excellent. So, yes, is it working? Yes. No, in our case, our view is very clear that we're all for openness. The trade agreement with the U.S. is just opening up with the U.S. market, but that doesn't preclude our pursuing openness with other markets. In fact, I just mentioned EFTA and the European Union have been kind of implemented this year, no? So we're definitely kind of open to trade, and we believe in the free trade, and we believe in the benefits of openness. So far it's not a tension. I was mentioning that even the trade agreement with the U.S., which maybe has their own geopolitical objectives, but really have not imposed on us any constraint on trading with other countries in the world, particularly China. So we don't see a problem with that, no? And the progress of Argentina on trade has kind of two aspects, no? Let me go back to this idea of tariffs. For example, Argentina has export taxes and has tariffs as well. We've been bringing those down. Of course, in order to bring those down, you have to bring down government expenditure, because Argentina has an institutional setup that the national government is the one that collects the trade taxes. So you need to bring down government expenditure, and then that opens up the fiscal space to reduce export taxes, which have been mostly wiped out, and also tariffs. But in the case of Argentina, I would say the most important ingredient for us to increase trade is something that Argentina was never, an input that Argentina was never able to put on the table, which was the respect of property rights. This is kind of the missing input that Argentina never could deliver on this. And the reason it could never deliver on this is on two reasons. The first one is that always had a very vulnerable fiscal situation. And if the government has a vulnerable fiscal situation, it's going to mess up sooner or later. It's going to increase taxes, it's going to expropriate, it's going to do something which is going to affect property rights. So the first way of re-establishing strong property rights in Argentina is having a strong fiscal result. And the second way of strengthening property rights for us is deregulation, because we also believe that every regulation is a way of chipping away some of your property rights. Imagine that you have a real estate development, someone comes with rent control, it affects the value of your property, it's affecting your property rights. So Argentina, in this path of deregulating and having a strong fiscal, is strengthening property rights. And the results are already there. For example, in 1 year, we've doubled our exports of minerals. Minerals is an export which is very strong on property rights. We still export, even having doubled this year, we still export only a tenth of what Chile exports. So imagine how far away we are and what the potential is, but all the missed opportunities that Argentina has. And the other, and with this I finish, Pierre, is we have a very large energy complex. We have the second largest reserves of shale gas in the world, even larger than those of the US and Texas. And there the boom is already underway because we are strengthening property rights and people feel that Argentina is a trustworthy place to invest. And look at these numbers. Last year, Argentina exported $80 billion. In 5 years, oil and gas, we're going to be exporting $50 billion. And this is already in the pipeline. So we're all for trade, but we also have to solve our problems. And our problems was basically having an economy where people can come, invest, and know the rules of the game are going to be upheld and their property is going to be respected.
Thank you, Minister. It certainly is the case that when the environment becomes tougher, you want to improve your game at home. Let me turn to